Open our ears and our minds and our hearts to hear what you would have to say to us. Help us upon hearing to understand, and upon understanding to act. In Jesus' name, amen. Reading from the Gospel according to John. As Jesus walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him,
Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?
Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world.
When Jesus had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him,
Go, wash in the pool of Siloam.
Then the man went and washed and came back able to see. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask,
Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?
Some were saying, others were saying,
No, but it is someone like him.
He kept saying,
I am the man.
but they kept asking him,
Then how were your eyes opened?
A man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, Go to Siloam and wash. Then I went and washed and received my sight.
Where is he?
I do not know.
They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. He said to them,
He put mud on my eyes. Then I washed, and now I see.
Some of the Pharisees said,
This man is not from God. He does not observe the Sabbath.
but others said,
How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?
and they were divided. So they said again to the blind man,
What do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened.
He is a prophet.
The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them,
Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see? We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But we do not know how it is that now he sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself.
His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. So for the second time they called the man who had been blind, and they said to him,
Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner.
I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see.
What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?
I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciple?
Then they reviled him, saying,
You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from.
There is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing.
You were born entirely in sins. Are you trying to teach us?
and they drove him out. Jesus heard that they had driven him out, and when he found him, he said,
Do you believe in the Son of Man?
And who is he, sir? Tell me so, that I may believe in him.
You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he.
Lord, I believe.
And he worshiped him.
I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind.
Some of the Pharisees near him heard this and said to him,
If you were blind, you would not have sin. But now that you say, we see, your sin remains.
the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Each of the four Gospels contains stories about Jesus healing those who were blind. The accounts differ in the details, of course, leading one biblical scholar to imagine that when all those individuals who had been healed met each other, it was the moment denominations were born. He imagines that when they first met, they were all excited about how Jesus had miraculously given them their sight. But then issues began to surface as they talked. They identified significant differences between them. For example, some of them had been healed simply by a touch from the Messiah. One of them boasted that his faith had been strong enough to not even need to be touched at all. Another one explained that Jesus not only touched him twice, but spit on his eyes. And the final one, here in John, described how his healing had been rather involved. Jesus had mixed his saliva with dirt and put the mud on his eyes and then told him to go wash in a pool of water. Well, it turns out all of these differences became a real issue for these guys. Each one thought his healing was normal and therefore better than the others. In the end, they couldn't reconcile their differences, so they divided themselves up. There were the Spittites and the non-Spittites, the Muddites and the non-Muddites, the Touchites and the non-Touchites. And that's when denominationalism was born. What is it about us that we feel the need to label or categorize or make caricatures of or practically dehumanize individuals and groups when they differ from us? What is it about us? Do we do it, as Walter Brueggemann suggests, to keep things manageable, under control, coherent, sensible? There's a Latin phrase for it, odium theologicum. It literally means theological hatred, the kind of intense hatred and anger that grow out of theological disputes. Those in non-theological circles have adopted the phrase as well, so that it can pretty much refer to most any dispute of a rancorous nature. John Stuart Mill, an essayist from the 19th century, cited odium theologicum in one of his works. He identified it in those he called sincere bigots, those who defend their beliefs based on moral feeling rather than sound reasoning. I think there was more than a superficial level of odium theologicum present in the story from John this morning. Jesus and his disciples encounter a man who's been blind from birth. The disciples want to know whose sin it was that made this man blind. The folk theology of that day was a cause and effect one. If you sinned, then these things happened. Jesus says that no one was to blame and proceeds to restore the man's sight, and then Jesus exits. The man who's been healed goes back home, where he surprisingly becomes a catalyst for a huge debate among his neighbors and friends. Opinions are mixed about whether he really has been healed. Folks want to know who did the healing and how it was done. Bottom line, as one commentator puts it, there is no joy, no praise, no thanking God, no encouragement, only quarreling. The healed man is dragged before the Pharisees, where the issue is that the healing took place on the Sabbath, making it a crime in their book. And when questioned, the man says, "A prophet of God healed him." Well, that's not enough for the authorities, so they subpoena the man's parents, who really don't want to get involved. He's an adult, they say. He can speak for himself. So the poor fella who has been healed, and who, by the way, never asked to be healed, is called back up to the witness stand and grilled a second time. "I keep telling you I don't have answers to your questions, but you keep on asking them," he says. "All I know is that I was blind, and now I see." My only conclusion is that this healer must be from God to do what he did. Maybe, with the way you all are persisting with this, you all really are wanting to become his disciples yourselves. And with that, the Pharisees throw him out. In the final scene, Jesus returns, and the healed man learns who his healer is. Eugene Peterson uses these words to finish the story. Jesus then said, I came into the world to bring everything into the clear light of day, making all the distinctions clear, so that those who have never seen will see, and those who've made a great pretense of seeing will be exposed as blind. Some Pharisees overheard him and said, does that mean you're calling us blind? Jesus said, if you were really blind, you would be blameless. But since you claim to see everything so well, you're accountable for every fault and failure. Did you ever read the story of the Little Prince? A lonely little guy has one encounter after another as he travels from planet to planet, and he develops great affection for this particular rose that he meets, and he misses it terribly when he leaves it. He becomes disillusioned when he learns that his rose is not the only rose in the universe. But a wise fox helps him to realize that his rose is precious and uniquely his, and that he's responsible for it. And as the fox is about to depart, he shares a very simple secret with the little prince. It is with the heart that one sees rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. It's with the heart that one sees rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. It's with the heart that the prophet Samuel was seeing when he visited Jesse that day. There they all were. Jesse, no doubt, a proud father who had just paraded all 7 of his sons in front of Samuel, only to have each one of them turned down. Even Eliab was rejected, the one with apparently Iron Man features. 0 for 7. But there was an 8th son, and so the call went out to fetch him. I'm guessing the rest of the guys worked hard at making small talk as we waited for that 8th son to arrive from tending the sheep, and arrive he did, and the next great, magnificent, powerful king of Israel was about to enter. And from the build-up, we expect Charlton Heston. Instead, in walked the runt of the litter, a little shepherd boy so insignificant even to his father that he did not merit being part of the earlier parade of sons. Seriously? This guy? This lad who has probably had more acne than facial hair, this is the one on whom the entire future of Israel depended? It's with the heart that one sees rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. The blind man who was healed was the catalyst for a huge debate. As a result, no joy, no praise, no thanking God, no encouragement, only quarreling. The disciples wanted to know whose sin caused that blindness. The man's neighbor pretty much decided he had to be an imposter. And the Pharisees had no way to fit what had happened into their frame of reference. All they knew to do was to excommunicate the guy. So many blinders on those whose eyesight was supposedly just fine in this story. There's a website that lists 82 synonyms for blinders. A few of the 82 have to do with the headwear for horses. However, the bulk of them just may surprise you. Authoritarianism is on the list, as well as bigotry, closed mind, cramped ideas, fanaticism, narrow-mindedness, pettiness, and yes, odium theologicum. When we turn our backs on others, when we disparage another person or a group of persons, when we regard our belief or approach as the norm, and therefore better than any others, then chances are pretty good that we've slipped on our own self-made blinders. Chances are pretty good that our own inner Pharisee, as one writer calls it, is alive and well, that place inside us that wrongly says, I see. This writer goes on to ask, what ways do we believe we see? Who are the people we cast out, believing that our version of Christianity is the greater and theirs the lesser? Conservative Christians? Progressive? Traditional? Evangelical? Fundamental? Emergent? Jesus the Christ says, you say you see, and thus you're missing the mark remains. Some years back, I had the immense thrill of hearing and seeing a production of Puccini's Tosca at the famed Metropolitan Opera House in New York City. The Opera House was just as marvelous as I had imagined it to be, from the deep red carpet to the massive chandeliers to those tiny little screens at each seat that supplied the subtitles. But shortly into the opera, I noticed an unfortunate situation. I was getting the subtitles on the screen at my seat, but as I glanced around, a good number of folks weren't. Their screens were blank. So at the first intermission, I told a friend who was with me that I was sorry she wasn't able to get the subtitles at her seat. I think I even offered to switch seats with her. "Oh, not to worry," she said, "my screen's working just fine." Turns out the screens were positioned in such discreet ways so as not to be a distraction to the entire audience. By design, I could only see mine and very few others. And there I was, so sure that I had it figured out. And while I felt bad for those I didn't think had the subtitles, I confess I felt a whole lot more good than bad that I had a screen that worked. Several months ago, I was chatting with a friend about this and that. We touched on a number of topics during our conversation. At one point, my friend shared a story about her now-grown daughter's experience when she was in high school. The daughter had a really tough time with one of her classmates, another female who, for whatever reason, found pleasure in bullying this daughter. The situation never really got better. So when the yearbooks came out in the spring, the daughter decided she would cut out the picture of the bully so you didn't have to look at it every time she opened the book. The daughter turned to where the bully's picture was, and just as she was about to dive in with her scissors, she thought she'd just turn to the other side of the page to see who was going to get taken out as well, collateral damage, as it were. Turns out, of all things, the picture that would be lost was hers. So she put down her scissors and she closed the book. 99 times out of 100, when we cut others out, we end up diminishing our own selves as well. And when that happens, there's no joy, no praise, no thanking God, no encouragement. Seeing rightly. I wonder how it would have gone in the story John told if there had been a different reception for the man who had been healed. If the disciples had pondered how they could be of help to the blind man instead of immediately working to sort out whose sin had caused his malady. If the neighbors and friends had welcomed him home with open and albeit curious arms instead of immediately challenging his very identity. If the Pharisees had invited the man to sit at table with them, marveling together at this miracle and the one who performed it, instead of jumping immediately to judgment. I wonder how it might go the next time we encounter that person or persons who, for whatever reason, causes us to do an inventory of our own controls and orthodoxies or frames of reference. I wonder how it might go the next time we find ourselves in the middle of an odium theologicum. Surely we are not blind like those disciples and neighbors and Pharisees. Surely not. Nah. Surely not.